In July of 2021, global finance was stunned when Beijing used a single sheet of paper to wipe out an entire $100 billion tutoring industry. Soon after, tech giants like Alibaba and Didi lost more than $1 trillion in market value. In the West, many mocked it as economic suicide. But what if I told you this was never suicide at all, only a cold-blooded operation? Why would a superpower deliberately smash its own trillion-dollar tech giants and refuse to rescue its people while the economy is bleeding? When Beijing delivered the killing blow to its own billion-dollar tech giants, much of the Western press celebrated. Analysts in Washington and on Wall Street mocked China's leadership as enemies of the free market, convinced they were destroying one of their own greatest soft power weapons. But that confidence was built on a deadly misunderstanding. Silicon Valley thought it had won when Washington rolled out brutal chip export bans, cutting Beijing off from advanced semiconductors. But that sanctions blade may have awakened a monster instead. For the US, this arrogance now threatens both national security and the safety of technology investors, because it is forcing the world's second largest economy into a wartime footing. NVIDIA chief executive Jensen Huang has warned that using chips as a weapon could end up tying America's own hands, because it forces Chinese companies to race toward homegrown alternatives at any cost. To understand the cruelty of this operation, you have to see it through the eyes of people preparing for a fight to the death. What made Beijing's ruling elite realize that being rich means nothing if you cannot defend yourself? For the past 2 decades, the West has been dazzled by China's surface-level prosperity. A massive consumer economy built on billions of Taobao packages, addictive short videos on TikTok, and a boom in ride-hailing and food delivery super apps. Young people were pulled into video games while online education platforms drained tens of billions of dollars from parents' wallets. To Wall Street, it looked like an endless gold mine and proof of a modern superpower. But to the military and strategic planners in Beijing, that glossy prosperity looked more like a hollow cancer, something eating away at the country's real strength. They came to a brutally simple conclusion. No matter how powerful a short video recommendation algorithm becomes, it cannot intercept a ballistic missile. An optimized food delivery app cannot build military artificial intelligence. And the extreme wealth of social media billionaires creates no real national power in a geopolitical conflict. If the US ever blocked the sea lanes and cut off the supply of core chips, that entire multi-trillion-dollar consumer empire could collapse into ashes within weeks. That is why Beijing decided to smash its own consumer rice bowl. The case of Didi Chuxing, the country's biggest ride-hailing giant, is one of the bloodiest examples of this new strategy. Just days after Didi rang the bell in New York for its public listing and raised billions of dollars from international investors, Beijing moved immediately to remove the app from every online store, citing national data security. That was not a random punishment. It was a cold message to the entire capitalist class and to every entrepreneur in the country. The era of easy money from user data and soft technology was over for good. What happened in the 2021 tech crackdown was really a violent and deliberate attempt to reroute capital. The state no longer wanted the country's smartest money flowing into video games or highly profitable e-commerce platforms. It was actively sealing off the easiest paths to wealth, locking down the speculative real estate market, and forcing the entire financial system, from giant state-owned banks to private investment funds, to pour its remaining resources into what Beijing calls core technology. That means semiconductors, aerospace equipment, and advanced materials. The leadership is willing to sacrifice growth, accept a decline in middle-class wealth, and crush any business that does not serve national security. The strategic logic is clear and ruthless. Survival matters more than surface-level wealth. And once you smash your own consumer economy, where does all that money go? How do you force trillions of dollars out of the hands of private billionaires and back into the driest, riskiest laboratories on Earth? When Beijing watched the West freeze $300 billion in Russian foreign reserves and cut Russia off from the SWIFT global payment system in the blink of an eye, Chinese strategists absorbed a lesson that went bone deep. That moment shattered every illusion of financial safety in a flat, interconnected world. They realized that it does not matter how many trillions of dollars you earn exporting plastic goods or cheap clothing if your enemy can press a button and paralyze your economy by cutting off your chip supply. Sanctions paranoia became a core strategic driver. To build an impregnable fortress, they concluded they had to achieve technological self-sufficiency at any cost. No fatal vulnerability could be allowed to remain. The enormous river of capital pulled out of soft tech platforms and speculative real estate was quickly redirected into the National Integrated Circuit Industry Investment Fund, better known around the world as the Big Fund. Most recently, the third phase of this super fund injected another $47 billion, turning it into the largest state intervention in human history, aimed at semiconductor self-sufficiency. Money poured like a flood into SMIC chip foundries and Huawei research centers. The goal was never immediate commercial profit. The goal was to break America's grip and the grip of its Western allies on the entire semiconductor choke chain. But stop for a moment. We need to look at reality clearly. It would be dangerously naive to believe that a superpower can simply throw tens of billions of dollars at laboratories and immediately produce the most advanced chips on Earth. You can use money to build a great highway overnight, but money cannot bend the laws of quantum physics. This ambitious plan is already bleeding heavily, and the cracks in commercialization are becoming impossible to hide. In 2022, a political earthquake ripped through China's semiconductor sector when several top minds and senior officials tied to the Big Fund were arrested in an unprecedented anti-corruption purge. Under massive pressure from the central government to spend quickly, thousands of ghost chip companies were created on paper for one purpose only: to siphon off generous state subsidies, despite being incapable of designing even the most basic integrated circuit. And no matter how much money they throw into the furnace, they are still crashing into a wall of stone. ASML's extreme ultraviolet lithography machines, the most sophisticated manufacturing tools on Earth, and the one thing money still cannot buy under sanctions? This war for semiconductor independence is far more expensive, chaotic, and filled with deception than state media would ever admit. However, this is the most frightening part of all. No matter how catastrophic the waste becomes, Beijing is still grinding its teeth and pushing forward. For the top leadership, the billions of dollars lost to corruption and the mountains of abandoned projects are simply tuition that must be paid. They are willing to tolerate every inefficiency because the price of giving up is not just losing a few percentage points of GDP growth. It is the risk of surrendering total technological sovereignty to the claws of the US. And if this expensive make-or-break gamble is going to continue, someone has to pay the bill. What happens when a political system stakes the fate of an entire nation on tiny pieces of silicon? To feed the money-burning machine known as core technology, Beijing has made a brutal choice. Let ordinary people fend for themselves in the middle of a recession storm. When the global pandemic hit and the economy froze, the US chose to print trillions of dollars and send relief checks directly to households, keeping the consumer engine alive. China refused that path completely. Even as youth unemployment soared so high that the government once stopped publishing the numbers, and even as millions of families were crushed by evaporating real estate wealth, Beijing never launched any broad consumer stimulus package. This was not because it lacked money. It was an ideological choice at the deepest level. In Kyushu, the party's main theoretical journal, the leadership repeatedly warned about the dangers of Western-style welfare. Their argument was simple. Giving out free money would only encourage laziness, weaken the will to work, and erode the industrial strength of the nation. Consumer stimulus only creates more clothes being bought and more overpriced milk tea being consumed, things with no value at all in a war for survival. Instead of saving middle-class living standards, the state is carrying out a vast stress test. It is training the population to tighten its belt, to endure hardship, and to survive the darkest periods, all in preparation for the worst-case scenario, when the fortress is completely isolated. Looking ahead, where does this brutal operation lead the world's second-largest economy? Based on the structural shifts already underway, three main scenarios stand out. In the base case, the most likely one, China goes through a lost decade on the surface. Civilian economic growth stays weak, domestic consumption remains frozen, and social discontent simmers beneath the surface. But behind that gray curtain, the country quietly succeeds in mastering the entire supply chain for older generation chips while locking down total control over critical minerals. In the worst case scenario, the pain of economic dispossession pushes beyond the physical limits of what people can endure. The anger of hundreds of millions of middle-class citizens and unemployed young people erupts, shattering the social contract and bringing the system down before the walls of the tech fortress are finished. In the most optimistic scenario for Beijing, the pressure forces its scientists into breakthroughs in new materials, allowing them to bypass Western lithography barriers altogether and permanently flip the geopolitical balance. Every one of these futures hangs on two core variables: how much hunger and hardship the Chinese public can endure, and how quickly Washington tightens the sanctions chokehold. And once you see that calculated endurance clearly, you begin to understand a cold truth that threatens the foundation of the current world order. Has America really prepared for a superpower that no longer cares about getting rich? The brutal contrast between these two worlds has never been clearer. As crisis after crisis paralyzed global supply chains, the US chose to throw open the treasury and print trillions of dollars, sending relief checks straight into the hands of ordinary people. Washington's capital allocation strategy reflects the logic of Western consumerism. It was willing to tolerate a historic wave of inflation that destroyed purchasing power as long as Americans kept spending, maintained their standard of living, and kept the aisles of supermarkets full of shoppers. Beijing's capital allocation strategy is the exact opposite. It reflects wartime survival. It squeezes the public, coldly accepts a deflationary downturn and the rapid impoverishment of an entire middle class, all to funnel every last renminbi into semiconductor foundries. While Americans used government relief money to buy new flat-screen televisions and upgrade their smartphones, millions of young Chinese lost their jobs and quietly watched the state pour tens of billions of dollars into dry, punishing semiconductor projects. But if you are a technology investor in Silicon Valley or a strategist inside the Pentagon, this surface-level austerity and desperation is not something to celebrate. Washington is swinging the sword of semiconductor sanctions with total confidence, believing it is the ultimate weapon for preserving global dominance. It believes that cutting China off from advanced AI chips will suffocate Beijing's ambitions. Yet, according to deeper geopolitical analysis from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, that sword has produced an unintended consequence. Silicon Valley once believed chip sanctions would be the killing blow. Instead, they trapped the Chinese economy inside a giant pressure cooker, forcing it to evolve and adapt at any cost. Those brutal sanctions swept away the last illusions of global cooperation still lingering in the minds of China's elite. They taught Beijing how to fight without bloodshed and forced the system to pursue supply chain self-sufficiency decades earlier than it otherwise would have. Now imagine the worst-case future for America if this bloody operation Beijing is carrying out actually succeeds. If this technology fortress is completed and China becomes fully self-sufficient in essential chip generations, then the entire sanctions regime, the most powerful economic weapon Washington has used to shape world order for decades, suddenly becomes a gun with no bullets. America would wake up to the shock of facing a superpower that can no longer be wounded by financial or technological sanctions. It would be confronting an adversary that has already grown accustomed to immense pain and no longer has any critical economic weakness for the West to exploit. This great struggle is no longer a race to see who can produce or sell more goods. It is a test of which system can absorb more destruction and still keep going. That is the moment when we have to rethink the entire game. How will history judge a sanctions regime that may have accidentally forged the most dangerous enemy of all? The West is rushing to celebrate too early, looking at a battered economy that is bleeding and unstable, without realizing that these may simply be self-inflicted scars, wounds cut deliberately so the system can squeeze itself into a suit of wartime armor. The $1 trillion that vanished from soft tech companies during that historic night in July of 2021 was really just the first tuition payment, a brutal but necessary sacrifice. The real battle now depends entirely on how long ordinary Chinese citizens can endure hunger and hardship until the day their impregnable technological fortress is finally complete. What exactly has America prepared to deal with a superpower that can no longer be hurt by economic punishment? Is the world confusing the dying cry of an economy with the hammer blows coming from a giant weapons forge?